I've watched a talk given at the University of Austin by Mark Oppenheimer, and was a very good talk. I just think one of the questions Mark kind of sidestepped. He didn't really want to open the larger can of worms. The question was simply, in his view, does the American free speech legal framework, sort of is the South African free speech framework, contrasted? Which one is better? What are the pros and cons? Um, I think Mark sort of responded to it in about a minute and a half, and he did say some insightful things, but he didn't really get into any of the deep waters about this issue. And I just thought it's a question worth talking. I mean, this is one of the topics that I keep on returning to because it's an important kind of topic. Um, the one thing that Mark didn't talk about at all um, was that essentially, politically, South Africa and America are fundamentally different things. Um, America doesn't really, if you talk to an American, they are indoctrinated with a kind of dogma around what it is America is. And that's because they don't fundamentally understand any other society and how other societies are are constituted. And so, you often hear this phrase, America is a democratic republic. So democratic is an adjective and republic is, sort of a noun. Uh, you know, the, a republic, translated from the Latin, is just the public thing, the public thing. So, uh, obviously, America is sort of defined by its constitution, but if you actually read the thing and understand the thing in context, you'll understand that what America fundamentally is a democracy. America is fundamentally a democracy, and its constitution is there to ensure that the democracy can maintain its democratic character. It's sort of like the rules needed in order to keep the train on the track and to keep the experiment going, and where it's going to reach its destination, is defined as a more perfect union, and that's the American experiment, and it has lasted and it hasn't ended yet. So well done. But America is fundamentally a democracy, and so in that context, the point of free speech is the lifeblood of the nation state, uh, as I've defined it, because a democracy isn't going to be able to self-correct if you can't think freely, and you can't think freely if you can't express yourself freely. So there's there's a more of a political pertinence to freedom of expression in the American context. Now, America, I would say, it's hard to criticize America because it's an old institution, and it was the first of its kind, and they certainly did well enough to make a system that has continued its progress. And obviously, South Africa has only lasted for 30 years, and it's already kind of gone off the track. But as an idea, the conceptual framework, we can contrast which one is more sound and the merits of both. But yeah, so there's a lot of context that needs to sort of be discussed in order to even get to an intelligent, or to raise intelligent points about this vast, deep subject. But yeah, okay, so let me continue on about America. So the American structure, I think, is prone to this criticism at the very least, which is that what is the point of the freedom of expression if you can't afford to protect your freedom of expression from private sources of encroachment? You if you get debanked in America, you're fucked. Well, again, you can't generalize about these things because it depends what state you're in. But essentially, there is no far-reaching protection for your freedom of expression against other private sources of suppression. And the South African legal system is superior in that respect, in that your freedom of expression is guaranteed against other institutions, other forms of, so if depending on the nature and the so the Bill of Rights is a set of rights which you can have in the South African context are rights that you are guaranteed vis-a-vis non-state actors. So other people do have a duty not to infringe on your fundamental rights. Now, the South African legal system gets around the obvious contradiction in this, or in that you then have a general limitations clause, where if I have a right to freedom of expression, and you have a right to freedom of expression, and you also have a right to all these other things, I can't be compelled to provide these things to you. I'm not the state. That's not my function. You can't. I have freedom of conscience. I have freedom of movement. I have my own conscientious beliefs. I'm not the government. You can't hold private citizens liable in the same way that you can hold the government liable for the provision of, let's say, the third generation rights, as they used to be called. So there are classes of rights in the South African context. There's first generation, which are, sort of rule of law, principled guarantees which we should immediately enjoy, and sort of second generation rights, which are rights that will sort of be progressively developed. And then there's sort of what I would even sort of class as third generation rights, which are things like the night watchman, in terms of I see the purpose of things like the equality clause in the South African context is that it effectively is a guarantee against the monopolization of resources. That you can't have private actors developing monopolies over the necessities of prosperity in life. That there's a sort of a built-in angle of right of the government to nationalize and quasi redistribute access. So we don't have a right to co-own things that don't belong to us, but we do have a right to access them as an amenity if they are a necessity for flourishing and development and all these sorts of things. So I can't think of any sort of practical example of that, but if there is going to be a sort of a concentration of anything to the degree at which you start getting things like, sort of the famous Marxist hypothesis that the system is begging to be overthrown, sort of the Constitution has sort of within it a pressure release valve and the legal mechanism essentially to make sure that the state can address that sort of challenge. You could call it the problems of maturing capitalism or something like that. But well, this is hypothetical. It might not be needed, but I don't see a problem in having a constitution that is sort of crafted in such a way that it can deal with the Marxist hypothesis if it should arise. And this I also see as a way to prevent state capitalism or state socialism in the long term, because just having the threat of the central government doing something about something will probably keep the system itself naturally democratized and avoidant to create monopolies. It's ironic at how anti-constitutional the state has actually become, though, in sort of guaranteeing and regulating in such a way so as to create a cornered market in many aspects. Sort of Vodacom is a perfect example of this, where the state has essentially colluded with private capital in order to create a lucrative cash cow that which they can only really, the only thing that they can justify that with is sort of national interest. But it sort of runs, I mean, as many things do, it runs absolutely counter to the actual contents of the Constitution, which, even before it was mangled a bit, actually directed that the state should move towards decentralization and sort of the distribution of powers from the higher spheres to the lower spheres, and empowering the lower spheres to take up the baton wherever possible, so that there was actually a constitutional duty to devolve powers that were otherwise reserved. Anyway, so what needs to also be understood is that law, as in the rule of law in the American context, falls by the wayside in favor of the power of the democracy. Now, Americans don't really understand any alternative to that kind of, well, if it's not in the hands of the democracy, whose hands would it be in? And they don't understand that, that's what the rule of law means. The rule of law actually means that law governs and not men, not humans making decisions, that the law should be somewhat permanent and fixed. Now, if you want to know who had a permanent and fixed law, it's the people who invented it, essentially, or at least in the form that we received it, at least in the Christian world. And that's the Romans. You have to remember that the Romans developed a legal system that was codified under Justinian that was robust enough that rich aristocrats, and these were the most powerful people in the world, at least in the Roman world, where they all respected the law, and they could all be bound by the law, and they could go to lawfare with each other under that law, and they could all play by the rules, because the rules had enough sort of fundamental, let's say, secular philosophical robustness that everyone could actually agree that there was justice to be found in that philosophically coherent, complete system. So, you actually have an intact system of law that isn't invented by people. Now, obviously, there's case law and there's development and there's the mores of society, and the Roman law takes these things into account, but it puts them in containers. It gives them places for them to be, so these are the weeds that Mark didn't get into. But essentially the Roman Dutch law which is the Roman law as received and canonized by the Dutch, is the fuel that the South African legal system runs on. And we actually do have a complete law. Therefore, our law doesn't need politicians to be in force and in effect and complete. So we actually have the rule of law in South Africa. In America, the democracy changes its mind, and the legislatures go in and they invent new things. And I mean, our legislature can also invent new things, but they somewhat fall underneath the Constitution, and they somewhat fall underneath the philosophical coherence of the complete system of law that the Roman Dutch substantive law has built into itself. So we have essentially substantive checks and balances within the legal framework, which America doesn't even is not sensitive to the existence of such structure. Yeah, so to put it bluntly, America does not have the rule of law. The American citizen is a lab rat to be experimented on by the democracy, essentially. And that is the fate, the curse of living in a democracy, fundamentally. Now, yes, you have some checks and balances against that. You have the Constitution, but even the Constitution is not, how do I put this? The Constitution itself fundamentally has to be unamendable based on some kind of substantive requirement. I think there is actually a section in the American Constitution where it's arguable that there is something like what is it? It's something like a general rule of general application. There's I think there is a constitutional argument that particular amendment does create a kind of substantive bind, that if you did want to alter the Constitution, the American Constitution, there are some procedural hoops and conditions that you would have to make sure that the amendment followed. But these guarantees that already exist in the American Constitution, in the amendment section, are not robust guarantees. The Bill of Rights in the American Constitution, is a marvelous set of values. I'm not trying to besmirch that or anything like that. I'm just trying to say that in the process in which the American democracy wants to change the nature of its own constitution, it is not really limited in any way to do so. In the South African context, it's completely different. You have to run the Section 36 limitations clause. If you want to change the Constitution, you have to, the legislation to change the Constitution will have to be run by the limitations clause itself, which has robust values built into it. So essentially there are liberal democratic checks and liberal democratic values which are substantively built into the amendment process. So you can't just amend the South African Constitution in an anti-constitutional way. You can't do it. Also, you could make some very good arguments as to why it would be illegitimate to do so, because, let's say the democratic legitimacy of the current parliament is waning, to say the least. If you look at, if you had to force parliament essentially to have empty seats in its body to represent the registered voters who do not vote, or even the bigger pool of, let's say eligible voters who are not even registered, if those seats had to stay blank, or empty, you wouldn't be able to pass anything. You wouldn't have a quorum. So de facto, I would say the democracy is a little bit defunct in South Africa, at least. All the more to, which in my view lends more credibility to the weight of the structure that did actually have a democratic mandate, and the ethos and the values of the 90s, that is embodied in the South African Constitution, which is still, I think, a jewel, uh, a precious thing. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here. So what is my point here? So my point is that America doesn't even have the rule of law. The Constitution in America doesn't have substantive safeguards against its own democratic fundamental character. So at the end of the day, there are no safeguards. And in this sense, the American experiment is honest about itself in the most human way possible, because you can try to have institutions that represent lofty values and ideals and structures. And, you have the perfect example in South Africa. That, all these things have devalued themselves and depreciated. But conceptually and structurally, I think the fundamental nature of the South African edifice is sound, and it is the most sound. And one could argue that South Africa is a victim of history to some degree. One could also argue that we're still young as a nation, and we still have a lot to reclaim and develop. And when I say reclaim, I mean in terms of what is within our reach, and what we could very easily grasp and make good use of. We have a lot of potential at hand to work into a magnificent future if we had, or if the electorate would develop some kind of sophistication, some kind of intellect. It's not easy when you have a captured media. No democracy. This is just a side note, I would say, and you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but to me it's quite obvious that the West has been quite heavily infiltrated by and captured in terms of ideological capture of all of our sense-making apparatuses. So journalism is in a very sorry state. And I mean, News 24 and IOL and, all the television news shows in South Africa are, you couldn't curse a democracy with a worse system of, sort of just intellectually bankrupt, and just sort of morally vacuous people. These are the people who quite clearly do not stand on principle. You get these academics that get interviewed, these professors, and their views and their analyses are quite obviously selected in order to promote quite an intellectually bankrupt, self-serving, sort of black economic empowerment, self-enriching scheme that, sort of the journalistic class themselves, is this sort of black privileged and quite entitled to their black privilege that they have ideologically garnered to themselves. And it doesn't matter at what cost it comes to the nation, at what cost it comes to the poor, at what cost it comes to as long as they are treated as the valuable token that gets to represent the underdog, that gets to represent the disadvantaged, and then it's quite a lucrative thing to be a token in this strange world where the poor get used as a human shield, and you don't get any cogent analysis of this phenomena, because all the journalists themselves are quite happy to be beneficiaries of this sort of symbolic redistribution of power, that they get to be the intelligentsia and the vanguard for this racial scapegoating and this sort of reemergence of Nazi philosophy, essentially. And it just keeps on failing upwards. The worse they do, the more damage they do. Somehow this proves that the racial scapegoat isn't being blamed enough and isn't being vilified enough. Just sort of they just keep on failing upwards. The more devastation they produce, the more carnage they have to recycle into their propaganda as to why they should be even more radical. But anyway, yeah, so I mean, and then you have these journalists and these academics sort of reinforcing these corrupt judges who, again, were sort of have been politically appointed, not because they're good jurists, but because essentially they're politically, ideologically in league with this transformationalism, or so we've got this betrayal of non-racialism, this betrayal of fundamental values, this betrayal of the Constitution, which is quite frankly treasonous. And well, anyway, my views on this are quite clear. We should execute these judges, because that's the only way that we're going to get any kind of, at least in death, executed judges will provide a platform and a basis upon which that they can be a kind of venting of anger, of righteous anger, at how the justice itself was depreciated. Because we really do need to bring back the constitutional revolution that we had in 1994. It has been destroyed by corrupt judges, and I think we need to destroy those corrupt judges in order to have a rebirth. And and I think it makes perfect substantive sense that these people's right to life, it's correct that we should sentence these judges to death for the treasonous corruption of the law, because in the way that they have deprived us of our first generational value and first generational rights to not be discriminated against on the basis of race, they have corrupted a whole society in many various different ways. by sowing the seeds uh, of civil war, of a racialist civil war as well, but also by creating a racial scapegoating and enforcing an ideology of collective guilt. By the way, collective punishment, which is basically the principle upon which Black economic empowerment is operating in the society, giving advantages and concentrating disadvantage based on who you look like, based on racial preferencing and racial disadvantage. This is effectively de facto amounts to collective punishment, which is a war crime. So these judges have permitted this level of divisiveness into our politics, which also has a knock-on effect of corrupting the Constitution, because essentially, if people can vote their way into choosing to elect people who will endorse racial legislation no matter what the Constitution says, because that's also what were the judges' excuse. They said that the rationale is that because there's a democratic endorsement of this legislation, the democracy should be able to decide how affirmative action gets expressed. And so they said, therefore, we're not going to actually run the lettered subclauses of the limitations clause, section 36 of the South African Bill of Rights. So they didn't actually run the lettered subclauses, the purpose and the extent of the limitation, less severe means of achieving the same purpose, all those lettered subclauses which force you to do a pragmatic overhaul of any limiting of any right. They didn't do that. They just gave up and they said the democracy gets to decide. So basically, these judges have endorsed Nazi Germany legal positivism. They have said you can tick the democratic box and then we don't do our job as judges. So these judges have not stuck up for constitutional supremacy. They've destroyed constitutional supremacy. They've destroyed non-racialism. And if they have decided, therefore, to destroy justice in our society, why should their lives not be destroyed on the altar of bringing that back? Why should they be given extra grace? And why should they be given... law must be a secular process as well. Tit for tat. If they are going to deny a whole society of their fundamental human rights, and they get away with calling themselves judges that they have masqueraded as. These are fake judges. These are people who do not deserve to sit on the bench. They deserve to be hung from the neck until dead. That is what they deserve. That is exactly what needs to happen to them. Now, obviously, I can only make that impassioned argument when they finally get prosecuted, but that is exactly what needs to happen and exactly what should happen. Or firing squad. I don't really care about the method of execution, to tell you the truth. It's not that important. Perhaps there'll be a humane methodology. As long as they're dead, they deserve to die. And I will say as well that I think that they will burn in hell for all eternity, for the damage they have done to this nation state. They will never be able to recover the damage that they have done to this nation state and the damage that they have done to the poor of this country and the political damage that they've done to this country. They are part of state capture. They are the ideological moral scum that facilitated the corruption of South Africa. These are people who I mean, there's a level of treachery and betrayal that in Dante's Inferno, they are closest to Satan. They really deserve their place with the false prophet in the lake of fire. That is where they are destined to live out their eternity. That is that is where their souls will be committed. I am sure of it. And we should facilitate and bring them closer to that end, because that is where they deserve to be. There is no grace. That's also, by the way, I think where Eusebius Macaisa exists now. We don't need to live through another fascistic regime. We don't have to live through another racialist human depravity and human disaster, which we're doing to ourselves when we allow the moral degeneration of a nation state that was all facilitated by corrupt, treasonous judges who deserved death for their treason. And they have destroyed a supreme constitution, which was the only living document in the world that actually deserved what it was. It deserved what it was, what's written in it, what it calls itself. It exactly is what it says it is. It's the Supreme Constitution. And the people who have deprived us of our Supreme Constitution and who have done real damage to real people through that betrayal, these people do not deserve forgiveness. They do not deserve grace. They deserve death. They must die for their sins. Sorry, that's a religious. They must die for their crimes. They have committed crimes against humanity higher than the politicians. The judges are worse than the politicians in this context. They really deserve to be hung from the neck until dead. Now, this is a legal case that I'm making. I'm not going to be like Julius Malema and encourage people to be vigilantes. That wouldn't help anything. But I hope the day will come when justice will be dispensed against these despicable people who deserve their punishment, more so than the politicians. It's one thing to be a corrupt politician and to be a despicable human being in that sense. It's another thing to call yourself a judge and instead to be an anti-judge, to be against the law, to be against the Constitution and wear a robe on the bench. It is beyond farce. This is why we can't have nice things. If we lived in a just world, the world police would come in and round up our judges and do it for us. If we lived in a just world. Obviously, there are no bodies like that, and perhaps it is good that there are no bodies like that. International bodies I'm talking about. But at some point, we need justice to be resurrected in this country. We need the Constitution back. We live in a constitutional crisis. But not only that, we live in a crisis of, well, many crises, but we live in a moral crisis. And we live in a crisis of justice itself has been fundamentally undermined. And, how we're ever going to recover from that is going to define who we are as a people. That fight is going to be the thing that develops the definition of the South African people. And we will see if we, through that fight, if we will deserve the democratic revolution in the first place. we will see then if we do deserve the new South Africa. If people are willing to have that fight, or which parts of the country are willing to go through that. I mean, I I think that we don't need a large nation state. Uh, we do need the constitution. I do think we do need that. And I just want to say that we have a robust legal structure that we can operate without a central government in that sense. We can have, although I do think that provincially, our judicial district should itself break away from the so-called South African Constitutional Court, because it's not a constitutional court worth respecting. It's not a court. It's a farce. And so, will this crisis of justice will it be resolved satisfactorily without losing the definition, the very unique structure that South Africa is the historical beneficiary of? I mean, we were very lucky that we were legally ceded by the Dutch and then preserved by the British, because the British had the foresight not to destroy something that was superior to their own legal system. Although the British procedural law was certainly superior to the Dutch procedural law, which is why the British basically trammeled over the Dutch procedural law and replaced it with their own. But procedural law and substantive law are not are somewhat distinct issues completely. Anyway, yeah. So my answer to the question as to whether South Africa has a superior freedom of expression legal framework to America. Again, I have to make a distinction between the conceptual framework as it exists on paper and how it's been contorted by so-called imposter judges. And by the way, I mean, I pretty much have the same view of imposter journalists. Although obviously I'm not going to issue sentencing of obviously anyone can pretend to be a journalist. It's just it's kind of disgusting that there is a sort of a confluence of miscreants that essentially run our society in terms of the intellectual cultural landscape. And it's just disgusting how little authenticity exists in that whole system. We just have sort of collaborators with what is sort of becoming a very controlling and insidious, sort of centralized authority. Although, there is a lot of latitude still in terms of freedom of expression. But anyway, sorry, I keep on verging on making a point about the original question, and then I keep on drifting off into side issues. But anyway, so freedom of expression. It'll be interesting to see if anything I have said will land me up in a contempt of court charge or a incitement of violence charge. Certainly, I don't encourage anyone to be a vigilante or to do anything against the law. What I want to do is the lawful execution of treasonous judges. Because, as I've said, there are no absolute rights in the Bill of Rights, and I do think that upon a proper inspection of the limitations clause in this case, I think it's more important to uphold constitutional supremacy, and the integrity of the Constitution, I think, can only be properly reclaimed by holding these judges ultimately responsible for the profound damage that they have caused. They have caused society. They have done damage to history even. They have done irreparable harm. They have betrayed their oath of office. They have obstructed justice and inverted it. They have perverted. They have turned the law into an instrument of anti-constitutionalism. They have turned the 1994 Constitution into a kind of fodder for a kind of hypocrisy. They have undermined the dignity of a people that revolted against an unjust system just to institute the same unprincipled form of injustice. And then we have academics that don't point out the moral principle and how it and the hypocrisy on the moral principle. It's the moral vacuum at the center of South African culture. The deafening silence of the so-called journalism. Anyway, yeah, so, sorry, the point that I wanted to make about, so in America, what good is your freedom of expression if the government can't stop you from freely expressing yourself, but you can be debanked? You can be, depending on the state, probably, Twitter can ban your account and you have no recourse. South Africa has some very good things. Like, for example, PADJA, the promotion of administrative justice. So, for example, if someone does an administrative action against you, you can ask for reasons, and they must be furnished. And then, based on that disclosure that you can compel, then you can take people to task for essentially stepping on your common law. Um, there are certain levels of evidence and fairness and procedure. Um, there are certain standards that you can therefore compel. Obviously, within some structures, there's no recourse. If you make yourself vulnerable to an organization that has an executive function that is performing an executive decision. Anyway, I don't want to get into the weeds of this sort of thing, but maybe this is the kind of thing that you do have to get into. You don't want the state vis-a-vis the judicial branch of government standing in and nannying every interaction that you have. There are certain freedoms of decision making that individuals, can choose not to like each other and choose not to associate with one another, and that is, the very nature of freedom of association. But essentially, if you are a bank or something like that, you can't just debank people because you don't really get a freedom of association. So, I know that in America there is this open question as to whether corporations get the same rights as individuals. And in South Africa, the answer to the question is it depends on essentially, if the members of the organization can be collectively protected by the organization being a front for their right in the Bill of Rights, then the organization will enjoy the right. So if you want an organization to enjoy a right in the Bill of Rights and litigate on the basis of the right, it's you're basically just piercing the corporate veil in order just to check that there is sufficient interest in the corporation or the organization holding the right. Anyway, I'm just trying to think if I've... Yeah, so the problem is that you don't want to shackle every executive body in every, especially in the private sector, or you don't want to shackle every private pool of power or private source of power or entity that wields power. You don't want to deneuter it of its executive force, because that is essentially how history gets made, and that is how things can happen and how decisions are taken. There is this cultural leftist bias essentially against people having, because when people have an executive preference or an executive expression of power, it's seen as a zero sum. That people are expressing their will and they have differential power because they have more power or more money or more influence, or they have the ability to persuade people. So I mean, you can say that some people who are capable of being persuasive are freer than others or more powerful than others. And then, so what? It offends those who believe that everyone should just be considered equal. I mean, I don't know where this equality propaganda sort of comes from, that equality before the law is a principle. It has nothing to do with actually people being equal in any way, shape, or form. They have an equal right to their dignity, and they have the equal recourse to access remedies based on their rights. But yeah, there's a lot of fudging going on, and there's weird sort of conflations because people don't understand, let's say, the meaning of phrases. So they, equality of what? Equality in what context? It sort of, it all blends together that you just use the word equality and somehow you've borrowed a very strange, dry conceptual framework in which, actually everyone is of equal value and therefore they should have equal power. And what does that mean in practice? Everyone must be dead because they can't act, they can't do anything, because if they did anything, it would be a zero-sum imposition on the world that would cut against everybody else wanting to do something equally important. So I don't know, there's just a lot of fuzzy, strange thinking. It has to do with, there's equality before the law, and then there's just the word equality. And these things just sort of mean very different things. And if you want to sort of conflate what is essentially a homophone, because when you say equality before the law and then you use the word equality, I think you are actually sort of subconsciously just confusing yourself, because the connotation and the meaning of sort of equality. The South African Constitution talks about enhancing equality, and that can be understood in the meaning that people have equal rights. So, in some sense, equality is achieved already in the first generation. And, how most rights are framed and phrased, they are phrased in terms of access. And if people have greater access to their rights, the equality that already exists is enhanced. Anyway, I've veered very far from the topic of freedom of expression. But yeah, so the biggest difference between the South African political system and the American political system is that America is fundamentally actually a democracy. It has a constitution, whereas South Africa is a constitutional republic, and it has a supreme constitution, and it has a democracy. South Africa has a democracy. South Africa is fundamentally not a democracy. It has a democracy. It has a supreme constitution. The emphasis in America is quite the converse. The converse being that America is a democracy and it has a supreme constitution until the democracy alters it. So does that make the constitution supreme? I mean, the whip hand is in the democracy. And also, the whip hand is in the people who own the guns. So they can ensure that it stays with the democracy. The power stays with the people. And so South Africa is a system that was birthed predominantly by the work of America in forging its history that it did and developing in the way that it did. And eventually, South Africa blossomed into what I consider to be the best legal structure in the world. At least from the Christian perspective. I don't think you can do better than the South African constitutional order from a civilizational perspective. This is a bit off to put it here, but let me just make the comment about the American system and one of its spiritual flaws, which is this is the curse that America suffers from in order to make the progress that it does make, and it surely does make spiritual progress, but America is like the spiritual war of the world inside of itself. It is really the engine of progress of history. Americans really do pay for their power in this sense. And the power of America is that it is the cauldron, the democratic chamber that facilitates evolution. And South Africa, I think, exists as a warning to America and has perhaps even facilitated some of its, if I can say that, South Africa is a kind of slightly counterfactual, but mostly it is the future of the West. South Africa is a kind of warning about the future to the West. And I do think that the experience of South Africa, I'm not saying that America has looked at South Africa and has taken it to be a sign of the future. I think America has developed itself in modern history, and it's gone through its own evolution, without doing that, without peering into South Africa. But South Africa has still existed as a parallel example of America's future. And anyway, I've tried to be somewhat a conduit of taking that insight from South Africa and funneling it into the American zeitgeist. Not that I've done it efficiently. I've tried to proselytize the insight that can be garnered from South Africa all over the world. Anyway, but let me say that the spiritual sickness that America is prone to, and sadly there's no getting around this, is that because America doesn't have the rule of law, and because America is effectively run by the people of America, and therefore it is infected with the rule of man, and it is therefore cursed by not having the rule of law. Now, this is a biblical law, as it were. You either have the rule of man or you have the rule of law, and America has the rule of man, and therefore the people of America collectively and through their democratic institution of their government these entities will be similarly cursed in the way that Saul was cursed in the book of Kings, written by Samuel. There's a question that haunts Saul constantly, and the question is constantly asked throughout the book of Kings, and the question is the rule of man one of the prophets? Is the king one of the prophets? Is Saul one of the prophets? And in the same way, the President of America, is he one of the prophets? The democracy of America, the people of America, are they one of the prophets? Are they collectively one of the prophets? Are they? I'm not saying they are, I'm not saying they're not. But the question is a dirty question. Because now you live in the Church of America, you live in a collective entity that is being a quasi-spiritual religious entity, because you have to ask, is the secular government one of the prophets? Is it? I don't know. I'm not saying it is, not saying it isn't. But the question is not a convenient question in spiritual life. I would rather say about my South African government, is my South African government one of the prophets? Well, the answer should be no. But now we have democracy. We don't have constitutional supremacy because of our corrupt judges. Our corrupt judges has polluted us with this Americanism, this American structure of government. I do actually think that the South African judges, before they made their disgusting judgment that threw the Constitution under the bus, they were advised by a Cambridge professor, and she gave them an American template, which just doesn't fly in the South African tradition. But they didn't give a damn, because they just were looking for any excuse. They were looking for any advice to facilitate their moral corruption of the state and to facilitate the ideological corruption that they chose ideology over the Constitution. And in so doing, they've thrown us to the wolves. They have demeaned our whole civilization. Not that they even had such lofty conceptual sensitivities. But South Africa used to be quite, because of the Roman law. I mean, people forget this, but during apartheid, the government hated the courts because the courts had limits that they would not let the government exceed. In fact, the courts were such a thorn in the side of apartheid that apartheid even tried to develop a high court of parliament in order to override the Roman Dutch law that was getting in their way. So already we have a history of politicizing justice. And you know what the judges did? Because the judges were so coherent and robust in their own separate political structure, they just laughed at Parliament and said, no, that's invalid. That's just bullshit. Now we have judges who only deal in bullshit, that only promulgate bullshit. And the only thing we have to correct the ship is the democracy. So, we've been betrayed by our politicians. It's somewhat to be expected. Betrayed by our judges, unforgivable. And now our democracy has to fix itself. And the people don't even know if the system is worth saving because it's so utterly contemptibly corrupted. But I mean, this is the fundamental difference between America and South Africa, is that, first of all, you can't have a perfect system. It's not possible. And America is the de facto pragmatic system because the last line of defense is the people. The first and the last in the American system is the people. So why not center that truth around the government? Because if that's going to be the fundamental truth, you might as well have a system that recognizes that about itself so that it doesn't go insane and it preserves its fundamental structure. But, America only functions the way that it does because they have 50 independent states that can each be their own individual cauldron of democracy and experiment. And people can always leave one state and go to another or something like that. And you have to hope that the democracy learns from itself and corrects its own mistakes eventually. But the South African civilization is much more methodical and robust and conceptually, structurally sound and reasonable and deeply connected with the best of history. We are the flourishing of that same romanticism that was developed by the Russian royalty that invented Romanticism and eventually, influenced Western Europe. Well, Russia was the heart of Europe before the Civil War, before the Russian Revolution. The engine of the West was Russia. The West didn't really recover from the Russian Revolution. That's kind of stopped the cultural engine. But I don't know Europe has really, ever since Napoleon, Europe has just been a complete shit show. Europe has never recovered from Napoleon. Britain only survived and had its depth survive because of its I don't know, all these strains of history. At some level, you need to have an introverted feeling set of values that is entrenched in a coherent system without what Carl Jung referred to as introverted feeling entrenched in a civilizational code, without a structure that represents a sociological edifice that can reproduce itself. I don't think you have enough of a resource for an individual to truly be sane and moral. Because if you don't have the rule of law and you live in a democracy, you're really in a goat fight. Politics is a little bit messy. It always will be. It's going to be a food fight. And you're going to fight against all the other ideological strains and differing values. It's good to have that kind of food fight, but you get to lose the battle and not lose the war, hopefully. And the war can also be lost, if the Constitution gets overhauled in a fundamentally defective way. But it's all up in the air in the American experiment. It's all up for grabs, if I can put it like that. South Africa, it's all settled. On paper, conceptually, it's all settled. We don't have to worry if our government is one of the prophets. We can work out who we think one of the prophets is in our own private spare time, in our own church. We don't have to belong to the state church of the democracy and then get cursed with this question, is the president one of the prophets? Is the president's advisor one of the prophets? We don't have to wonder these things. Because in some sense, the state is a function that has already been settled. In America, it's fundamentally unsettled. And the Constitution in America is the train on the tracks. But where's the destination? We don't know. In South Africa, it's not a train. We're not going somewhere. We've arrived. And then we have our own private energy and our own private enterprise and our own private soul to operate from and within. We don't have to deal with these collectivized worldly questions. That was the so it's a different cultural regime. It's a different zeitgeist. It's a different civilizational blueprint. And I'm not going to say that America is wrong and South Africa is right or vice versa. They have their merits and they have their demerits. And perhaps it's good that they both exist and that they're somewhat complementary, at least for those willing to do the analysis. I guess I don't really have anything else to say on the matter. But yeah, I mean, this might come out of left field, but I do think that I should probably make it available, but I did come up with a proposed legislation for hate speech when there was public comment being asked for the hate speech legislation. I developed a legal test myself, but I broadened the ambit of the legislation to some extent. I called it hate speech and anti-constitutional damages, or constitutional damages. So I said, that my act would prohibit constitutional damages and hate speech. Because I do think that if you campaign against the Constitution, that itself can cross certain thresholds of threatening harm. And I realized that I'll try and make it available on this recording if anyone's interested in that. But there were some really good elements in my proposed legislation. One of them is that I developed a very clever test, I think, for being able to basically, it was a legal test that was very valuable in the sense that there are two legs of the same test, and you have to do both of them, and then you have to see if they reconcile at the end. And if they don't reconcile, then you've made an error in law. So it's very clever in that it forces the judge to reverse engineer their own ruling, and it forces to make sure that the jurisprudence is refined at a very high level. And that, I think, was quite an ingenious invention, if I do say so myself, because it compels the jurisprudence to have a very high quality. It enforces that the jurisprudence be at a very high quality. I'm just trying to. This was years ago when I wrote this, but I'm just trying to remember the actual the nature of the two legs of the test. What was it? It was something like okay, it's not actually that long, so I think I'm just going to read my proposal. Purpose of this version of the bill: provide for the offence of hate speech or constitutional damage and the prosecution of persons who commit that offence, provide for the prevention of constitutional damage or hate speech, promote the moral standards and principles of the Constitution and its fundamental values, thereby safeguarding the dignity and constitutional protections and guarantees of social justice through, inter alia, the criminalization of bigoted claims accompanied by incitement to perpetuate unlawful harm that contravenes constitutional values such as non-racialism and non-sexism, or the fairness referred to in the equality provisions, to prevent people from confusing partisan political argumentation with claims about an objective morality that can be confused as protected speech, as when such claims of an objective morality is incompatible with supreme constitutional order or its values, remove and displace the broad and nebulous overreach that such similar laws may perpetrate, and thus removing the racialist tenor and the selective enforcement of such laws that has already been cultivated by the misapplication of constitutionally incoherent jurisprudence by public institutions such as the South African Human Rights Commission, which has created a toxic atmosphere of unequal and racialist utilization of interpreting the protections conferred by the Constitution, therein dealing with the issues of the destabilization of the liberal political system of law and order, as its framing has been slowly eroded and decontextualized, as the Constitution itself has been targeted for scorn and blame in the face of facilitating political diversion, in obscuring liberal political instruments and other lawful democratic means to redressing public sentiments of grievance or political demands that border close on navigating a political economy into being radically reframed, normalizing and calling forth virtue signals through the expression of anti-constitutional propaganda. These issues are therefore also closely related to matters that lead to public violence and disorder, as well as the general standing of the Constitution, being that is gradually being guided and slid towards authoritarianism and unconstitutional political sentiments by anti-constitutional rhetoric that amount to hate speech that this bill correctly identifies as anti-constitutional propaganda, thus seeking to secure the Constitution as a source of fundamental moral guidance over society and its legal strictures, and placing the constitutional standards for conduct between any persons or citizens within the South African legal jurisprudence in prominent view to being enforced against everyone according to clearly delineated standards which are in keeping to the standards of the rule of law, and which as a byproduct will maintain the conceptual coherence of the morality contained in the Constitution's provisions. Because otherwise, when secondary legislation that was meant to represent the Constitution is either morally nebulous or simultaneously discordant with the rule of law, then the standing of the Constitution itself is further diminished and damaged. Therefore, a morally coherent and precise bill is needed to prevent the slide into further damage to fundamental constitutional values and to safeguard the general standing of the Constitution itself. Okay, Number 2, provide for the proper conceptualization of unlawful incitement to hatred, which threatens, incites, or leads to unlawful sources of harm. And then I put as a comment on this, which also grounds and includes the concept of constitutional damages with respect to clearly delineating the threshold of intolerance suitable to attract criminal sanction, in brackets, clearly confronting and solving the intolerance paradox problem for liberal societies. 3, providing a mechanism of similar effect to mini-constitutional judicial law review to reconcile incoherent constitutional jurisprudence over any relevant constitutional provisions, thus facilitating clarity on important constitutional values and provisions, which can also make education and dissemination of constitutional values more readily accessible and cogent. In brackets, a civics educational curriculum or modules needs to also be seriously considered at some point that also extends into the subject of the justice system, basic fundamental constitutional values and principles in practice, and the structure and features of an open, liberal democratic political framework for entrenching human dignity into civilizational model, in brackets, a model without equal in its moral virtuosity, accepting only those who have achieved the status. Talking about other societies, or accepting only those who have achieved the status of faithful emulator. So anyway, I'm talking about South African exceptionalism. My phrasing is a little bit weird. Anyway, definition of hate speech or constitutional. So I wrote this very quickly because I had like a 48-hour deadline. Okay, so this definition of hate speech or constitutional damage. It has 1 and 2. So 1, the propagation of views, beliefs, sentiments, and opinions through materials inciting constitutional damages, which are made unfairly without, at the very least, an attempted substantiation alluding to some grounds that eliminates invalidity or providing for the fairness of such materials, or providing an atmosphere for an implicit or broader context being relied on to indirectly or virtually invoke a set of grounds that speak to the elimination of invalidity or provisions of fairness to such materials. So just I wrote some comments in some of these things. So my definition of hate speech and constitutional damages has 2 elements. The one is the propagation of views, beliefs, sentiments, and opinions through materials inciting constitutional damages. So it's all based, therefore, on constitutional damages. And then the second element is that which are made unfairly. So this whole system is just basically, you have to prove 2 things. You have to prove constitutional damages, which I define later on, and you have to prove fairness or unfairness. And those are the 2 tests, by the way, I believe. Definition of materials. Expressions in the form of writing, speech, or other mediums which either contents intended to transmit or produce communication or otherwise to retain, relay, or convey information. And definition of made unfairly. Made unfairly does not simply mean not fair. The materials must also be assessed and found to be unfair, thereby pertinent technical points of style and the substantive content and how the targeting is performed in the materials, and how these materials contain claims that must be carefully surveyed and assessed to be considered. In any of their relevant subsets or interconnective webs of interrelated subsets to unfold and investigate any possible consideration held within the set of claims to be found contained by such materials. Claims targeting immutable characteristics are rebuttably presumed unfair until otherwise substantiated as being properly reasonable and justifiable, after which the propagation of such a view should then be considered an example of fair discrimination. Claims targeting mutable characteristics have no presumption of unfairness to overcome, so therefore a positive finding for unfair discrimination must be argued and proven to secure a conviction of hate speech. The full scope of the meaning of made unfairly or unfair discrimination are alike and will also closely relate with issues located within the validity indicator, which fully subsumes the topic of unfair discrimination, which is necessarily bound to the morally correlated task of ascertaining a ground of overall invalidity. Any finding of an assessment of invalidity is synonymous with finding that such materials are made unfairly. So I'm basically laying down two conceptual categories here, that you have made unfairly and you have a kind of an objective view of invalidity. So there's going to, okay, and I'll just go on because it will get into the two legs of the test. Defining of inciting constitutional damages. Anti-constitutional propaganda is synonymous with constitutional damages in respect of any materials that amounts to claims targeted against any characteristic, which further includes either the encouragement of permissibility that amounts to indirect as well as direct incitement of any unlawful harm or likely source of unlawful harm to be committed against someone or group being targeted on the basis of the characteristic, or threatening or campaigning for the removal of constitutional rights, or overtly making encouragement or inciting solicitation towards some imposition of special treatments in law on the basis of targeting the characteristic, which would lead to either infringing upon constitutional rights or fundamental constitutional values, in brackets, while circumventing or foregoing the limitations clause in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution and or any relevant equality clauses and provisions. And then I wrote a comment here, in italics or whatever, constitutional damages which pertain to directly targeted characteristics mentioned by provision 16.3 in the caveated or unprotected expressions found in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution will amount to a guilty verdict without the need of any assessment of either fairness or invalidity, as already conforming to a special case of constitutional invalidity, so long as incitement of constitutional damages have been ascertained in relation to such targeted characteristics, in brackets, that of race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. Note, as even acts of Parliament wishing to amend the Constitution with the requisite majorities in place must first have their constitutional amendments tested and passed against the limitations clause in the Constitution before becoming settled law, so as not to create a paradox of de facto legal positivism and parliamentary supremacy, when the South African Parliament should always itself already be foremost bound by the Supreme Constitution and only capable of seeking a legitimate mandate from the people through campaigning by political manifesto, and such a campaigning and manifesto should obviously not itself incite constitutional damages or include unprotected speech, at which point it would have already been unlawful and invalid as incompatible with the supreme law. In this way, the Constitution may only be amended to increase or expand on the protections it provides for, and not to reduce or negatively subtract from any of its already existing provisions, which relate to any existing protections, freedoms, or rights in the Bill of Rights in Section 1 of the Constitution. The Bill of Rights may not be reduced. It is even unlawful for anyone to seriously contemplate this, as it would amount to the criminal conspiracy to commit constitutional damages in the forms of perpetrating actions inconsistent with invalid with the Constitution. Parliamentarians are not above the supreme law, and those enthroned with institutional power should especially have their power checked by law that confirms compliance with constitutional values and the duties imposed by the rights in the Bill of Rights. So I'm basically spelling out that politicians and judges are not above the supreme law. In fact, they are firstly prone to it, and therefore if you try to make a manifesto for a political party to reduce the rights in the Bill of Rights, that's a criminal act. So I'm bounding the Constitution above the democracy. and the supremacy of the Constitution above the democracy. Provision for the coherence and self-consistency of the Supreme Constitutional Order. The two grounds of validity and fairness act as independent indicators of guilt by their separate assessment. However, a finding of fairness confers exoneration and a finding of invalidity confers guilt, with no further assessments needed to secure such an exoneration or indication of guilt. If, however, both assessments are performed and both findings have been arrived at and fail to both agree and correspond to one another, as in that guilt via invalidity and exoneration via fairness are both ascertained by the separate assessment of the same materials, then some provision of the Constitution, and perhaps especially the provisions of the limitations clause or equality clauses, have been incorrectly applied or interpreted, and an egregious error in constitutional law has been propounded by a presiding officer in need of immediate rectification or constitutional judicial law review, and a newly regulated procedure as required to recover the constitutional order from the apparent disjuncture in jurisprudence which infringes the Constitution by seemingly imposing an untenable paradox of self-inconsistency upon the Constitution, proximately caused by either incoherent or badly developed ratio, that means reasoning. Sorry, I've lost my place. Required to recover the Constitution from an apparent disjunction, which infringes the by seemingly imposing an untenable paradox. Badly developed ratio decadendi. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the Latin correct, it's a dead language. That must be immediately reconciled and cured for the proper administration of justice and to preserve the standing and moral coherence of the supreme constitutional legal order, as is the appropriate corresponding duty fit to match those powers wielded by presiding officers who functionally dispense justice in the name of the constitutional order and thereby wielding its supremacy in their functional role. Okay, so, and then I've just got as a note here, if incitement of constitutional damages is present, a later finding of unfairness is an independent indicator of guilt. Oh, so that's just my introduction to fairness. Okay, so this is the point about fairness. If grounds are found to substantiate that materials claims amount to fair discrimination, then the materials will also not be considered as being made unfairly, and accordingly the prosecution will fail in respect to such materials. If the materials themselves alludes to some grounds of fairness for the claims contained therein, or the materials had included an attempt to allude to a ground of fairness that was broadly implied, or the materials indirectly or virtually implied a broader context that contains grounds of fairness for the materials claims, then such materials claims are not to be regarded as unfair. Fairness need not be exhaustively evidence for a finding of unfairness to be avoided, and only providing reasonable doubt that the accused materials were not unfair, while this would fail to prove or overtly vindicate the fairness of such materials, or finding that the materials were not unfair will mitigate a finding of guilt with respect to the fairness indicator. In the case made against such an accused, they may still be convicted based on the separate indicator of invalidity. So also the case where fairness can be later located or found and shown to be somewhat commensurate with the original material's context, way of thinking or expression, in such a way so as not to force a dishonest interpretation of those materials in their deeper, real, or full context. Claims relating to immutable characteristics are presumed unfair, with the presumption rebutted and defeated by providing evidence of reasonable doubt on the basis that grounds for fairness and moral soundness consonant with fundamental constitutional values are either believed on in good faith by the accused or honestly held by the accused. So I'm basically saying, to use an analogy, putative self-defense is a defense. To make an analogy to putative self, if you believe that your life was under threat, that's a bad analogy. Let me not use an analogy.
if you believed that you were making a fair point and you weren't making a fair point, it's good enough. Because then you don't have the mens rea, essentially. Anyway. And if you believe that you didn't have, any contradiction with constitutional values, fundamental constitutional values, and you had that good faith belief, then that's also basically a defense. Okay, or were honestly believed at the time of the producing the relevant materials or adjacent materials being introduced to provide for broader context. So I've also basically said that materials include adjacent materials that can be introduced to provide for broader context. So not only do you get your materials that are being, let's say, that you're being accused over, but you get to essentially amend your materials with broader context with adjacent materials. But anyway, there was some wording on that earlier. These findings are either believed on in good faith by the accused or honestly held by the accused, or were honestly believed at the time of the producing of the relevant materials or adjacent materials being introduced to provide for broader context. These findings do not amount to a finding of fairness, rather just a failure of the prosecutor to prove unfairness adequately through the disapproval of any establishment of reasonable doubt. Claims related to mutable characteristics must be alleged and proven to be unfair by the prosecutor beyond reasonable doubt, or the prosecutor must at least prove that materials were not fair in order to make use of the alternative assessment. In terms of the separate validity indicator, where invalidity must be ascertained to secure a conviction of hate speech. Okay, and then I go into invalidity, and then I make a note before it. Invalidity is an independent indicator of guilt and also provides the full test for when hatred reaches a threshold fit to attract a criminal sanction for hate speech or constitutional damage. Validity. Claims carrying an irrebuttable presumption of invalidity, then I've got square brackets here, because such claims clearly propagate a scope for inciting constitutional damage. In the case of any materials claims of the nature described by 1 and 2 in the list below, while material claims of the nature described by 3, 4, and 5 in the list below will also amount to inciting constitutional damages when coupled with targeting the immutable characteristics mentioned in Section 9.3 of the Constitution's Equality Clause: race, sex, pregnancy, ethnic or social origin, color, age, disability, and birth. Note, to service some very fringe cases involving this list of irrebuttable presumptions that carry the automatic findings of both invalidity and guilt, pregnancy should not be considered an immutable characteristic for the purpose of this leg of assessing invalidity. We may have problems within our democracy, but no fundamental and serious defects with our individual or collective ownership of an open, liberal, democratic society. One, an open, liberal. Okay, so these are the 5 things, these are the 5 claims that I'm making that essentially people do not have the right to contradict. Okay, so the first claim is an open, liberal democracy is a fundamentally unjust or oppressive model for structuring cultural, social, or political systems. An open, liberal democracy is a fundamentally unjust or oppressive model for structuring cultural, social, or political systems. Number 2, the South African Constitution is a fundamentally unjust or oppressive document. Number 3, an individual's moral character or worth is determined by that individual's immutable characteristics. Number 4, an individual, because of their immutable characteristics, bears responsibility for the actions committed by other individuals possessing the same immutable characteristics. Number 5, an individual, by virtue of an immutable characteristic, is inherently unjust, bigoted, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. So, I don't know if I give an explanation as to why pregnancy should not be considered an immutable characteristic. I think I put that further on. It's probably because fundamentally it's not an immutable characteristic. It is a term that is carried by a woman, but it's not. That term is not. Is sort of fundamentally temporaneously mutable, so it just wouldn't fall under these sorts of characteristics. So it just anyway. Invalidity is linked to an unlawful source of harm being incited or encouraged. Claims made against just any, whether mutable or immutable characteristic, must also incite constitutional damages to be found invalid, or call for or incite an unlawful source of harm, which, on the basis of targeting any characteristic, would simultaneously amount to falling beyond the scope of the constitutional provision for protected expression, potentially also attenuated by the provisions related to the practice of equality, which such clauses themselves would also be the cause of some secondary form of inciting constitutional damage. Via the incitement to commit malpractice regarding the relevant equality and potentially relevant limitations clause provisions in the Constitution, i.e., merely promoting or counseling avoidance by proselytizing to others to use their freedom of association and freedom of contract to avoid or disconnect from individuals or groups defined by any particular mutable characteristic, would not be an unlawful source of harm, even if it would cause uncomfortable repercussions to those targeted by materials containing such claims. Therefore, not all harms constitute the requisite threshold of harm, attracting criminalization under the offense of hate speech or constitutional damages contained in this bill. Next paragraph. Constitutional damages must be regarded as the pivotal element to hate speech. Criminal injuria already exists to deal with the crimes against the person. Dignity and non-racialism can already be constitutionally imported to bolster the common law involving criminal injuria, and this natural process has already happened, as it should continue to do so. Tolerance is the cornerstone of any liberal democracy, and necessary line for distinguishing when to stop tolerating intolerance must be clearly and plainly drawn, and the tolerance of those who utilize their freedom of speech, even when the form that speech may take is that of open chauvinism or bigotry on the basis of mutable characteristics, should perhaps best be regarded as being naturally relegated to the informal regulation offered by society and culture itself as a whole through social norms of politeness, so as to attract societal cultural scorn or other forms of taboo, shaming, or censure, without the heavy hand of the state to impose moral concordance, and thus without state interference to deflate the sails of moral argumentation and confrontation otherwise caused when robust debate is chilled, as would be the effects of coercive sanctions, which may blanketly label such expressions as unfair discrimination, and thereby making them difficult to morally investigate, engage, or confront without a vibrant public square. And such debates should not merely be left to those privileged beneficiaries of academic or religious credentials to hide behind their dogma of their academic standing as an excuse to enjoy more freedom of speech than others. Thereby, academic standing as an excuse to enjoy more freedom of speech than others. I just repeated that. Thereby, each individual, according to their own individual assessment, beliefs, and discretion and moral judgment, can explore sentiments and ethics as an organic part of personal exploration and moral investigation, and such exchanges as the backdrop of an individual's freedom of association of conscience, therefore are necessary to be openly negotiated by free exchanges of such views, which should not attract criminal sanction until it rises to the level of threatening to incite unlawful forms of harm or other kinds of already established forms of unfair discrimination, i.e., the institutionalization of unjust administrative action or reduction of any constitutional protections that are already enshrined in law, or threatening to indirectly impact on the rights of others by way of removing people's political freedoms or other constitutional rights which allow such people to enjoy their full measure of owed tolerance and liberty within our shared and open society, within the magnificence of our open liberal democracy that does not impose strict openness but tolerates some forms of intolerance where that intolerance does not exceed the bounds of the liberal intolerance paradox, or said differently, does not threaten to overturn the preservation of or supremacy of the South African constitutional order. Okay, the next major point, superseding other tentative sources of exemption. This constitutional damages and hate speech formulation supersedes and penetrates the parliamentary privilege contained in Section 4 of the Constitution and provincial privilege contained in Section 6, as it is justified infringement of any freedom of expression performed on behalf of such an appointed democratic representative or the citizens that they may be representative thereof. It applies to everyone all the time in the territorial and legal jurisdiction of South Africa. Next point, penalties and considerations in sentencing, omitted for the sake of my limited time for the preparation of this submission. General editing notes in of this version of the bill. That's it. Yeah, so basically the two tests of validity and fairness. That was the main point. Oh, this was very rushed. But anyway, at least I have some expression of my view published in some form on the internet now. Anyway, probably not that interesting to go through all of that, but if anyone wanted to piece through that, they could see that. Oh, yeah, no, I mean, obviously the presentation of this isn't brilliant, but at least conceptually, substantively, I think there's enough substance there to. I think that it's quite clever to make a legal test of fairness and a legal test of invalidity, and then to make sure that you have kind of an objective invalidity and a subjective fairness. But if you make a kind of finding of unfairness, it also has to be invalid. And so, it's not... those two things would have to line up as sufficient to make the law sound and grounded and properly in a kind of coherent agreement with itself. Anyway.